The night air hung thick over the Mercer plantation like a shroud that refused to lift. October 13, 1847. Georgia lowlands. Red clay still warm from the day's sun, cicadas screaming their ancient hymn, and inside the white-columned house, a family sat down to eat. They never stood up. One moment there was the clink of silver, the murmur of voices, the scent of roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread drifting under the door. The next, silence so complete it felt like God himself had pressed a finger to the lips of time and whispered, "Enough." When the door finally opened, the candles were still burning low, the food still steaming faintly, the good china untouched by any hand that would ever eat again. 4 empty chairs. One half-finished plate belonging to a 14-year-old girl. And a mystery that would haunt the South longer than any ghost ever could. This is the story of the Mercer family. And what took them, may still be watching. The Mercer plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Georgia bottomland like a kingdom built on borrowed time. The soil here was the color of dried blood, rich, stubborn, and unwilling to forget. Every furrow had been cut by hands that never owned the land they died for. Every whitewashed fence, every manicured garden, every gleaming column of the main house had been paid for in sweat, blood, and something darker that no ledger could ever record. Thomas Mercer had inherited it all at 28, the land, the debts, the 87 souls he legally owned. By 43 he had the face of a man who had spent his life adding columns of numbers and subtracting human mercy. His eyes were pale gray, always moving, always calculating risk and reward. He walked the fields at dawn with a ledger in one hand and a whip in the other, though he preferred to let the overseer do the actual striking. A gentleman, he liked to say, keeps his hands clean. His wife, Ellanena, was 33 and still beautiful in the way expensive things remain beautiful long after their purpose has been served. Charleston-born, she had traded merchant respectability for plantation grandeur and had never stopped reminding everyone of the bargain. Her dark hair was always coiled tight as a noose. Her dresses were imported silk. That whispered when she moved. But her eyes held the flat, polished look of someone who had learned early that softness was a luxury she could not afford. Their children carried pieces of both parents like inherited curses. Catherine, 19, was already promised to young Hutchkins 5 miles away, a marriage that would double the Mercer holdings and silence the creditors circling like vultures. She moved through the house like a ghost who hadn't yet died, speaking only when spoken to, watching everything. Her hands were small and white, but they trembled when she thought no one was looking. William, 17, was the golden heir, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, quicker to anger. He had already begun practicing the same cold arithmetic his father used on the enslaved. "One day this will all be mine," he would say, standing on the porch at sunset, as though the land itself owed him obedience. And then there was little Margaret. 14. The only one who still laughed out loud. The only one whose eyes still held light. She loved the stables, loved the kitchen smells, loved sneaking extra biscuits to the children of the house servants when her mother wasn't watching. Some nights she would sit on the back steps and stare at the quarters, humming hymns her nurse Ruth had taught her in secret. She was the last pure thing in that house. And perhaps that is why she was taken first. The main house itself was a federal-style monument to fragile control. White columns rose like bones against the sky. The wraparound porch caught every breeze and every secret. Inside, the walls were papered in deep green and gold, the floors polished until they reflected candlelight like still water. But if you stood in the hallway at night and listened, you could sometimes hear the house breathing old timber settling, or something else entirely. 40 enslaved people kept that illusion of perfection alive. Ruth, the head housekeeper, had been there 23 years. She had buried 2 of her own children in unmarked graves behind the quarters and raised the Mercer children as though they were her own. Her hands were scarred from lye soap and years of service, but her eyes were sharper than any ledger Thomas Mercer ever kept. She knew every crack in every wall. She knew every sin this family had tried to bury beneath starched tablecloths and Sunday prayers. Samuel the cook had trained in Charleston kitchens and could make even the plainest meal taste like mercy. He moved through the kitchen like a man conducting a private orchestra, knives flashing, pots singing, the scent of thyme and garlic rising like incense. But at night, when the family was asleep, he would stand at the back door and stare toward the river, whispering psalms his grandmother had taught him before she was sold away. The night of October 13th began like any other. The weather was unnaturally mild, warm enough that the evening felt borrowed from summer, yet a damp wind from the river promised rain before dawn. Fireflies drifted across the lawns like lost souls searching for home. Inside the dining room, the long mahogany table had been set with the good china, the blue and gold set Ellanena only brought out when she wanted to remind herself she was still better than her circumstances. There was no guest. No birthday. No holiday. Ellanena had simply declared, "We will dine formally tonight." Ruth had asked no questions. She had learned long ago that questions could cost more than silence. Samuel prepared roasted chicken basted in butter and herbs, new potatoes glistening with salt, greens wilted perfectly in bacon fat, cornbread still steaming from the iron skillet, and a custard that quivered like forgiveness. The family gathered at 7 o'clock exactly. Thomas at the head. Ellanena to his right. Catherine and William across from each other. Margaret at the far end, swinging her legs beneath the table the way she still did when she forgot herself. The door closed. The servants withdrew. For the next hour and a half, the only sounds leaking from the dining room were the soft clink of forks, the murmur of conversation, and Margaret's occasional laugh, bright as a bell in an empty church. At 8:30 Ruth approached the door carrying the silver tray for the second course. She knocked once. Politely. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. When she pushed the door open, the sight that met her would lit behind her eyes until the day she died. The table was exactly as she had left it. The first course had been cleared, proof the family had eaten. The main dishes sat cooling, chicken skin now dull instead of glistening, vegetables beginning to wilt, bread hardening at the edges. The candles had burned down 2 full inches, wax pooling like tears on the silver sticks. But the chairs. Every single one was empty. Thomas's seat pushed back neatly. Ellanena's napkin still folded beside her plate. Catherine's fork resting exactly where she had set it down. William's glass of water half drunk. And Margaret's plate barely touched, as though she had taken one bite and simply stopped existing. No overturned chair. No spilled wine. No blood. The windows were latched from the inside. The heavy velvet drapes hung motionless. The only door was the one Ruth herself had just opened. Nothing, not a single thread, not a single crumb, was out of place. It was as if the family had been lifted straight into heaven, or dragged straight into hell, without disturbing the air itself. Ruth's scream tore through the house like a judgment. Samuel came running from the kitchen, still clutching a dish towel. His face drained of color when he saw the room. The younger servants clustered behind him, eyes wide, hands trembling. Within minutes the entire household knew something unholy had occurred. Torches were lit. Lanterns swung. The search began in a frenzy of fear and disbelief. They tore through every room. Every closet. Every attic crawlspace. They checked beneath beds, inside trunks, even the root cellar where the air smelled of damp earth and forgotten prayers. The grounds were combed by firelight, lawns, gardens, the smokehouse, the carriage house, the stables. The horses were still there, untouched, stamping nervously as though they too sensed the wrongness. They reached the river by midnight. Mist rose from the black water like ghosts refusing to leave. They dragged the shallows with poles. They found nothing but snapping turtles and the reflection of their own terrified faces. By dawn, neighbors had arrived. 50 men on horseback and foot scoured the countryside for miles. They found no tracks. No abandoned carriage. No sign that 5 living souls had ever left that dining room. The county sheriff, James Harrow, a man who believed every mystery had a simple, earthly answer, arrived the next morning with the expression of someone who already knew he was wrong. He interviewed Ruth first in the kitchen, where the smell of uneaten custard still lingered like a rebuke. Her voice never wavered. They were there. I heard them. I served them. I closed the door. When I opened it again, the Lord had already taken them. Harrow examined the room himself. He ran his fingers along the tablecloth. He studied the candle wax. He checked every latch, every hinge. He even tasted the soup, now cold, as though flavor might reveal what logic could not. Nothing. The interviews with the other servants were the same. Consistent. Terrifying in their simplicity. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard a cry. No one had passed through the kitchen or the side doors. Even the enslaved field hands, questioned briefly and dismissively by Harrow, offered the same hollow answer: "We were in the quarters, master. We saw nothing." But Ruth saw more than she spoke. In the days that followed, when the searches had begun to fail and the whispers had begun to grow, she would stand at the edge of the quarters at dusk and murmur the same verse from Exodus under her breath. "I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." She never explained why. But those who heard her understood perfectly. Because some sins cannot be hidden behind good china and formal dinners. Some debts cannot be paid with cotton and credit. And sometimes, when a house has been built on the backs of the suffering and the prayers of the broken, heaven does not knock. It simply arrives. The Mercer family was gone. The dinner was still on the table. And the red clay of Georgia waited, patient as judgment, for whatever came next. And the dining room. No one entered it anymore. Not the remaining servants. Not the neighbors who occasionally rode up hoping for news. Not even the children from the quarters who once played near the back steps. The table remained exactly as Ruth had found it that October night, plates congealed, candles guttered into grotesque shapes, Margaret's half-eaten portion now a shriveled monument to innocence interrupted. Someone, perhaps Ruth herself in a moment of exhausted ritual, had draped a single white linen cloth over the entire setting. It was not to preserve the scene. It was to hide it. But cloth cannot silence what the soul remembers. Of the 40 souls who once kept the plantation breathing, perhaps half remained by winter. Some stayed out of habit, out of the terror that leaving might invite worse punishment than staying. Others slipped away under cover of moonless nights, following the old paths their grandparents had whispered about, north toward uncertain freedom, or deeper into the swamps where no white man would follow. Those who left took nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever small memories they could carry in silence. Those who stayed moved through the empty house like ghosts tending another ghost, keeping the illusion of order because order was all they had ever known. The legend grew faster than the weeds. In taverns from Savannah to Augusta, men lowered their voices and spoke of spirits rising from the red clay to claim what was owed. Women in quilting circles whispered of abolitionist raiders who had spirited the family away under darkness, though no abolitionist had ever been seen within 50 miles. Old men sitting on store porches told of curses woven into the very land, every acre bought with stolen lives, every bale of cotton stained with blood that never washed out. The earth remembers, they said. And when it remembers too much, it takes back what belongs to it. But legends are comfortable lies. They wrap horror in poetry so the mind can bear it. The truth, the real, human, filthy truth, was uglier, smaller, and infinitely more cruel. Thomas Mercer had been drowning for years, and no one had thrown him a rope. The plantation turned a profit on paper, enough cotton to keep appearances, enough corn and pork to feed the household, but the margins were razor-thin. Ellanena's appetites had widened them into chasms. She ordered bolts of silk from Charleston as though tomorrow would never arrive. She hosted luncheons with crystal and silver that cost more than a field hand earned in a decade. She repapered rooms no one used because the old pattern offended her eye. Thomas paid for it all with notes he could not honor. 3 creditors in Savannah. A banker in Charleston whose letters had grown from polite reminders to open threats. A merchant in Atlanta who had already sent an appraiser to walk the grounds and estimate what the land might fetch at auction. By the summer of 1847 the letters arrived weekly. Each one thinner, sharper, colder. Thomas began to drink before supper, not the polite glass of claret, but raw corn whiskey from the still behind the smokehouse. His hands trembled when he signed payroll sheets. His temper flared without warning, then collapsed into hours of staring at the wall, calculating sums that refused to balance. He was 43 years old and already looked 60. Ellanena saw the drinking. She saw the trembling hands. She saw everything except the end approaching. Or perhaps she saw it and simply refused the sight. denial had always been her sharpest weapon. She continued ordering fabrics. She continued planning autumn entertainments. She continued smiling at neighbors with the serene certainty of a woman who believed money was infinite because she had never been forced to earn it. Catherine knew. At 19 she had already learned to read the silences between her parents better than any book. She had overheard the arguments. Behind closed doors, seen the unopened letters on her father's desk, watched the way Thomas's shoulders hunched lower each month. She understood that her engagement to Hutchkins was not romance, it was collateral. Her body, her future, her womb traded to keep the columns from going red. She had accepted it the way a prisoner accepts chains, not with joy, but with the numb resignation of someone who knows resistance is futile. Until she could no longer accept it. In April of that year, under dogwood blossoms heavy with rain, Catherine had given herself to Henry Garrett, the neighbor's youngest son, 21, handsome in a careless way, and utterly worthless by planter standards. No land. No inheritance. No future beyond charm and a quick smile. They met in the river woods where Spanish moss hung like funeral veils. They met in the hayloft above the stables while the household slept. They met once in the garden at midnight, laughing softly until fear choked the sound. It lasted 6 weeks. Then came the missed courses. The nausea at breakfast. The terror that settled in her bones like winter. She told no one but Ruth. Ruth, who had buried her own children, who had raised Catherine on lullabies and hidden kindness, did not hesitate. She went to an old woman named Mama Zora in the quarters, a healer whose hands knew roots and leaves the way Scripture knows sin. Mama Zora gave her a bundle of herbs wrapped in muslin, pennyroyal, black cohosh, tansy. Ruth brewed them in secret, forced Catherine to drink the bitter tea 3 times a day. The pain came like judgment. Catherine bled for days, fever rising and falling, sweat soaking the sheets while Ruth sponged her forehead in whispered prayers no white preacher would recognize. For one night Ruth thought the girl would die, eyes rolling back, breath shallow, skin cold as river clay. But dawn came. The bleeding slowed. The fever broke. Catherine lived. The child did not. And the secret was buried deeper than any grave on the place. But secrets are never truly buried. They rot. They fester. They send up shoots that pierce through even the most carefully tended soil. Ellanena suspected. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough to sharpen her gaze. She noticed Catherine's pallor after the illness. She noticed Ruth's protective hovering. She noticed the way Catherine flinched when touched. She began to question, never directly, never crudely, but with the surgical precision of a woman who had learned that power lies in what is left unsaid. Catherine denied everything. The lies only widened the gulf between mother and daughter until silence became hostility, and hostility became open war. William noticed nothing. 17 and golden, he rode his horse across the fields, hunted quail with the sons of neighboring planters, courted a girl named Eliza whose father owned twice as much land as Thomas. He dreamed of the day the plantation would be his, assumed it would always be there, solid as the red clay beneath his boots. He assumed fathers fixed things. He assumed mothers stayed beautiful and distant. He assumed the world owed him ease. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, saw only the surface. At 14 the adult world was still fogged glass. She believed her parents loved each other the way parents were supposed to. She believed the house would stand forever. She believed laughter could outrun sorrow if you ran fast enough. She still slipped biscuits to the kitchen children. She still hummed hymns Ruth had taught her. She was the last light left burning in that house. And light, when surrounded by darkness, becomes the first thing extinguished. October 13, 1847. The air was soft, almost tender, a false promise before the storm. Samuel's meal arrived on silver trays, chicken crisp at the edges, greens dark and glossy, custard trembling under its nutmeg veil. The family sat. The door closed. For a little while, the old rituals held. Then Thomas's hand shook as he lifted his glass. He had received the final letter that morning, 30 days or seizure. The whiskey had not numbed it. It had only sharpened the edges. Ellanena noticed the tremor. She always noticed. She made a small, cutting remark about the wind too heavy, too common, but the barb was aimed at him. Thomas answered with irritation. She pressed. He pushed back. Within minutes the table had become a battlefield. You have failed us, Ellanena said, voice low and lethal. As a husband. As a master. As a man. My father would have died before letting this happen. Thomas's face darkened. Your father traded in silk and slaves on paper. I trade in land that bleeds for every dollar. Land that is slipping through your fingers, she answered. Because you cannot say no. To me. To anyone. Catherine, silent until now, set her fork down. The sound was small. It might as well have been a gunshot. Perhaps if you had not spent every cent that came through the door, she said quietly, we would not be here. The room froze. Ellanena turned slowly. What did you say to me? Catherine's voice trembled, but she did not stop. I said you spend like the money is yours to burn. Dresses. Parties. China no one needs. You never ask where it comes from. You never care that father is drowning. Ellanena rose. You will apologize. Now. I will not. Catherine's eyes filled, but her spine stayed straight. Because it is true. You have ruined us. And you pretend not to see it. You pretend nothing is wrong while everything collapses. Thomas stared at his plate. William stared at his sister as though she had grown another head. Margaret's small hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. Ellanena's voice dropped to a hiss. After everything I have sacrificed for you. Sacrificed? Catherine laughed, a broken, bitter sound. You have taken everything from all of us. The words hung in the candlelight like smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. And in that suspended moment, when every hidden sin, every unpaid debt, every unspoken wound lay naked on the table, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the house. In the air itself. As though a door long closed had been quietly, irrevocably opened. The name landed like a stone through stained glass. I know what you did. I know what you are. Catherine's fork clattered against porcelain. William froze mid-bite. Margaret's small chest rose and fell in shallow, frightened bursts. Thomas lifted his head slowly, eyes glassy from whiskey and disbelief. I don't know what you're talking about, Catherine whispered. The lies sounded thin even to her. Don't insult me with denials. Ellanena leaned forward, knuckles white on the table edge. I know you met him in the woods. I know you let him touch you. I know you carried his child, and I know Ruth helped you murder it. The word murder hung between them like smoke from a fresh wound. Thomas's head snapped toward his wife. What in God's name are you saying? Your daughter, Ellanena spat, is no innocent. She has lain with a worthless boy. She has conceived in sin. And when the consequences came, she poisoned the life inside her with Ruth's help. Our own housekeeper turned abortionist to save your precious reputation. Catherine's lips parted, but no sound came. Her face drained to the color of river silt. Ruth stood motionless by the sideboard, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed bone white beneath dark skin. She did not flinch. She did not deny. She simply waited the way she had waited through 23 years of secrets, beatings, births, and burials. Ruth, Ellanena commanded. Tell him. Tell your master what you did. Tell him how you damned my daughter's soul to save her shame. Ruth's eyes met Thomas's for one long second. Then she looked away. She said nothing. Thomas rose halfway from his chair. Enough. This ends now. But Ellanena laughed, a sound like ice cracking over deep water. Ends? It's only beginning. Your daughter is ruined. Your son is blind. Your plantation is forfeit. And you, she turned the full weight of her gaze on him. You are nothing but a drunkard who has squandered everything my name once carried. William surged to his feet. You will not speak of Catherine like that. She fell in love. She made a mistake. You've made her life a prison, you've made all our lives prisons. If she couldn't come to you, it's because you've never been a mother. Only a jailer. Ellanena stood. Her chair scraped backward like a scream across the floorboards. Ungrateful. All of you. I gave up Charleston. I gave up respectability. I gave up everything to elevate this family, and this is my reward? Lies? Defiance? Shame? Catherine spoke then, voice quiet but steady as stone. You gave up nothing. You took our choices. Our secrets. Our breath. You treated us like inventory assets to be polished, traded, displayed. You never loved us. You loved what we could buy you. The room seemed to hold its breath. Thomas slammed both palms on the table. Silver rattled. This conversation is over. He pointed at Ellanena. Go to your room. At Catherine. You too. At William and Margaret. Finish your plates. Now. No one moved to obey. Ellanena swept from the room first, skirts hissing like serpents across the floor. Catherine followed, head high, but hands shaking so violently she had to press them to her sides. William sat heavily, face flushed with helpless fury. Margaret, silent through it all, began to weep without sound, tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the untouched custard. Thomas remained standing at the head of the table. He stared at the wreckage, cold chicken, wilted greens, Margaret's small, abandoned fork. Something inside him gave way, not with noise, but with the quiet snap of a branch too long burdened. He sank back into his chair, put his head in his hands, and whispered, to no one, to everyone, to God perhaps. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. William reached across and laid a hand on his father's shoulder. We'll fix this, Father. We'll find a way. Thomas did not answer. His shoulders shook once, twice. Then stillness. The candles guttered. The house settled around them. Like a coffin lid. What followed was not supernatural. It was worse. It was human. The family scattered like ashes from a dying fire. Ellanena locked herself in the master bedroom. Catherine barred her door and sat on the floor with her back against it, knees drawn to her chest. William tried to stay with his father but eventually retreated upstairs, footsteps heavy on the stairs. Ruth led Margaret to her room, tucked her beneath the quilt, kissed her forehead, and lied softly, "It'll be all right, child. Sleep now." Margaret cried herself into exhausted slumber, believing, because she had to, that tomorrow would mend what tonight had shattered. Thomas stayed in the dining room. Alone. He finished the wine in the glasses. Then the bottle. When that was gone, he rang for more. Ruth brought it without a word, eyes averted, and left him to the dark. Around 9 o'clock Ellanena descended again. She had changed into a simple dressing gown, hair repinned, composure restored like armor. She found Thomas still at the table, head bowed, bottle half empty. No one heard what passed between them. No servant lingered near the door. But whatever words were spoken, accusation, plea, threat, they were the final spark. Thomas rose. He seized her arm. She pulled away. There was a brief, ugly struggle, a shove, a stagger. Ellanena's heel caught on the rug. She fell backward. Her head struck the sharp corner of the mahogany sideboard with a sound like wet wood splitting. She crumpled. Did not move again. Thomas stood over her, breathing hard. Blood crept from beneath her dark hair in a slow, black ribbon across the floorboards. He stared, not with horror, but with the numb recognition of a man who has finally crossed the line he swore he never would. He called for William. His son came down, sought his mother's body, and went pale as death. But he did not scream. He did not run. He simply asked, voice flat, "What do we do?" They carried her together, Thomas beneath the shoulders, William at the knees, down the narrow stairs to the cellar. The air there was damp and cold, smelling of earth and old potatoes. They laid her on a narrow cot used for storing winter blankets, covered her with a rough wool throw, closed the door, locked it. Upstairs, Thomas found Catherine. "Your mother had an accident," he said. "She's resting. She'll be fine." Catherine searched his face. She saw the tremor in his hands, the fresh sweat on his brow, the way his eyes refused to meet hers. She said nothing. She returned to her room. Later, much later, when the house had fallen into uneasy quiet, she slipped down the hall to William's door. She knocked once. He let her in. He told her everything. The fall. The blood. The cellar. Catherine listened without interruption. When he finished, she sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. "She pushed us all," she said finally. "Until something broke. And now it has." They found Thomas in the study, staring at nothing. The three of them sat in near darkness, one lamp burning low, and tried to think past the panic clawing at their throats. No doctor. No sheriff. No confession. If word got out, Thomas would hang. The plantation would be seized. The children would be cast into poverty or worse. Everything, the columns, the land, the name, would vanish. Thomas spoke first, voice thick with whiskey and despair. "We leave. Tonight. We go west, Texas, California, anywhere no one knows us. We start again. Clean." Catherine nodded slowly. William swallowed. "And mother?" "She stays here," Thomas said. "In the cellar. No one will look." "Not for a long time." "But Margaret. 14. Innocent. Terrified. If left behind, she would talk. She would cry. Someone would ask questions. She could not stay. And Ruth. Ruth had seen Ellanena carried down. Ruth had locked the cellar door behind them. Ruth knew. Leaving her meant certain betrayal, eventual or immediate. She could not stay either. Thomas made the decision in silence. He called Ruth to the study. She came, eyes wary but steady. "We're leaving," he told her. "West. You come with us. You keep serving. You keep the secret. Or you stay, and answer to whoever finds what's in the cellar." Ruth looked at each of them and turned to Thomas, broken, William, pale, Catherine, hollow-eyed. She understood perfectly. Freedom was no longer a word that applied to her. Only survival. "I'll come," she said quietly. Samuel was not told. He slept in the quarters, unaware. But even in sleep, he felt the wrongness, the house breathing differently, footsteps moving in the dark, doors opening and closing like whispers of judgment. The night deepened. The candles in the dining room finally died. The red clay outside waited, patient and unforgiving, for the family that had built its empire on blood, to pay the final installment. He carried the habit of clearing the table like a prayer he no longer believed in. When he pushed open the dining room door, the sight stopped his heart for a full beat. The table waited exactly as it had been abandoned. Plates crusted with uneaten chicken. Vegetables shriveled into dark curls. Margaret's small fork resting beside a half-moon of untouched custard. Candles reduced to blackened stubs, wax hardened in grotesque drips like frozen tears. Chairs pushed back neatly, as though the family had simply stepped out for air and never returned. Samuel stood in the doorway. He did not scream. He did not run. He simply understood, in the marrow-deep way only the powerless can understand, that the white people who owned him had done something irrevocable. And that whatever it was, it would swallow him too if he spoke too soon. He closed the door softly. Went to the quarters. Gathered the few still remaining old men, young mothers, children too small to remember freedom. In the dim glow of a single lantern he told them. The family is gone. Something terrible happened tonight. Prepare yourselves. Whatever comes next, it comes for all of us. No one asked questions. They had learned long ago that questions invited whips or worse. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon, the Mercer family, or what remained of it, was already miles away. Thomas rode ahead on his gray stallion, face set like granite. William flanked the wagon, rifle across his lap. Catherine sat beside Margaret in the back, one arm around her trembling sister, the other clutching a shawl as though it could shield them from memory. Ruth rode in silence on the wagon bench beside the driver they had hired in haste, a free black man who asked no names and took coin without looking twice. Beneath the tarp in the wagon bed lay Ellanena, wrapped in oilcloth, bound with rope. Thomas had told the children it was supplies, heavy goods for the journey. But the smell had already begun, faint at first, then insistent, sweet and rotten, seeping through the canvas like a confession no one wanted to hear. They traveled by night, avoided turnpikes, slept in thickets. Thomas spun the same story to innkeepers and ferrymen. Planter from Georgia. Sold the place. Seeking better soil out west. Most nodded. The frontier was full of men running from debt, from wives, from hangmen. No one pressed. But the body could not be carried forever. In the mountains of eastern Tennessee, where the air grew thin and pine needles carpeted the ground like forgotten prayers, Thomas chose a ravine choked with laurel and rhododendron. They dug no grave, too much noise, too much time. They rolled stones over her instead, piling them high until the shape beneath was lost. Thomas spoke no words. No prayer. No apology. He simply turned his back and walked away, the children trailing behind like shadows lengthening at dusk. They reached a small settlement in Arkansas by early spring 1848. Thomas bought land with what remained of the Savannah drafts he had cashed before fleeing. He kept the name Mercer, too exhausted, too arrogant, or too broken to invent another. He told neighbors he had come for the milder winters, for fresh beginnings. They believed him. Or pretended to. For a season, it almost worked. Cotton sprouted. A cabin rose. William broke ground with the energy of a young man trying to outrun guilt. Catherine kept house, spoke softly, smiled carefully, choosing suitors who never asked about Georgia. Margaret grew quieter each day, her laughter replaced by long silences and dreams that woke her crying. Ruth faded fastest. The journey had carved lines into her face deeper than time should have allowed. The secret she carried pressed against her ribs like a stone in the chest. Fever came in late summer, low at first, then raging. She lay in a lean-to cabin at the edge of the property, sweat soaking the thin palate, breath rattling like dry leaves. On the third night she called for Thomas. He came alone. Sat on a stool beside her in the dark. Ruth's voice was thin, but steady. "I wrote it down," she said. "Everything. The dinner. The words. The fall. The cellar. The flight. Every sin." Thomas leaned closer. "Where?" "Hidden. Safe. If I die, it will be found. The truth will come out. Ellanena's blood won't stay buried under rocks forever." He demanded the location. She refused. "It's my insurance," she whispered. "My only power. You took everything else." She died 3 days later. Thomas tore the cabin apart, floorboards pried, walls searched, dirt beneath the hearth dug up. He scoured the property. Questioned neighbors under guise of concern. Nothing. The journal vanished into legend, a ghost written in ink. Thomas lived another 14 years. Pneumonia took him in the winter of 1862, as cannon smoke drifted east from distant battlefields. He died whispering apologies to no one in particular. William fought in gray wool, survived, returned to farm the land he had helped steal. Catherine married a quiet widower, bore 3 children, never once spoke of her mother or the red clay she had fled. Margaret married 2, raised a family, carried the weight in silence until 1934. On her deathbed at 87, she called her eldest daughter close. In a voice cracked by age and memory, she told the story, the argument, the fall, the wagon, the stones in Tennessee, Ruth's fevered confession. Her daughter listened, stunned. But by then the players were dust. No court would open. No rope would tighten. The truth had become a family heirloom, heavy, useless, and impossible to sell. Back in Georgia, the plantation crumbled. Columns rotted. Roof caved. The dining room filled with vines and bird nests. By 1900 only foundation stones remained, half sunk in earth that had waited patiently to reclaim its due. Yet the story refused to die. It twisted. Grew teeth. Became whispers in parlors, tales on porches, spirits rising from the clay, divine hands snatching sinners mid-meal, candles still burning in empty rooms a century later. People preferred the supernatural. It was cleaner. It absolved. A curse could be blamed. A ghost could be feared. But human weakness, greed, rage, cowardice, the slow poison of unspoken hate that was too close. Too ordinary. Too terrifying. In the 1960s, a historian named Elias Ward followed rumors to the old Mercer place. Guided by fading maps and stories from descendants of the quarters, he dug beneath the collapsed cabin that had once been Ruth's. He found a tin box, rusted shut. Inside, a small leather journal, pages warped by damp but legible in places. Ruth's careful hand recorded it all. The dinner's unraveling. Ellanena's accusations. The shove. The crack of skull on wood. The panicked flight. The promise she had extracted in Arkansas that truth would not be buried forever. Ward published in a small academic quarterly. Few noticed. The article gathered dust in university libraries. The public preferred their version, the vanished family, the eternal meal, the divine hand that struck without warning. Because the real story offers no comfort. No mystery to solve. No monster to slay. Only this. A woman died because control was her god, and it failed her. A man killed because weakness was his chain, and whiskey loosened it. Children survived by burying memory deeper than bodies. A servant carried truth like a hidden blade, her only weapon against a lifetime of chains. And a table waited in an empty house, food cooling, candles dying, chairs vacant, silent witness to the moment when love curdled into resentment, when debt became desperation, when family became fugitives from their own blood. The Mercer mystery was never unsolved. It was simply ignored. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what hides in the dark. It's what sits at the dinner table every night, until it doesn't. What do you believe? Was it accident, or murder in slow motion? Did Ruth's journal tell the full truth, or did she spare one final mercy? Do secrets like these ever truly stay buried? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from, especially if you're in the South, near old plantation land where the clay still remembers. If this story settled cold in your chest, hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share it with someone who isn't afraid of the dark truths behind closed doors. Because history isn't made of ghosts. It's made of people. And the terrible, ordinary things they do when no one is watching.